Hello, I'm Llewellyn, the host of House Chronicle. I'm glad to welcome back to the broadcast the co-host, Adam Clayton Powell III. Today we're going to talk about Canada and the new relationship established by Donald Trump, less loving, less kindly, less friendly than it has been heretofore. Our guest today is Markham Hislop, a Canadian journalist and host of the Energi show, and that is spelled Energi. Markham, welcome to the broadcast. What is the tone? What is the feeling among people in Canada since the American president has suggested that this huge country, larger in physical size than the United States, should become the 51st American state?
Well, overwhelming anger. And the best analogy that I can give you is imagine that this is a marriage, the long-standing, long-term marriage where one of the partner cheats and trust is utterly betrayed. That's how Canadians feel. And to give you just one example to illustrate my point, our Prime Minister, who is Mark Carney, the PhD in economics from Oxford, a former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, very well known climate finance circles at the global levels. Now our Prime Minister, he spent the weekend giving press conferences describing how his government, if he's reelected, we're in a national election right now, would re-engineer the Canadian economy away from the integration with the US economy that has characterized it over the last 50 years. We are essentially leaving the relationship, and we're going to go east and west in our trade. We're going to go to Asia and Europe, and we will, to the extent possible, break the bonds of the relationship with the United States. He said the old order of economic integration, military integration is over. That's an exact quote. And I think that illustrates quite nicely how many Canadians feel.
There must be some dramatic polling numbers on this. You're having the political campaign now, and so the pollsters are no doubt watching the trends and feelings. This must be showing up pretty dramatically.
You have no idea. There's an old saying in Canada, we don't elect governments, we throw out governments. So the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau had been in for 10 years. He stepped down in January, and there was a little bit of a bump in the popularity of the government. But then Donald Trump started talking about annexing Canada, using economic pressure to annex, maybe even a military invasion was hinted at. And that Canadians were so angry that the huge lead that the Conservative Party of Canada had over the Liberal Party evaporated in a month. And now the Liberal Party under Mark Carney is headed, according to polling, well into majority government status. And the Conservatives have basically dropped by like a rock. So what President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have done is completely turn around the political fortunes of the Liberal Party and essentially rewriting all of the political allegiances within Canada. There's now more unanimity between the 10 provincial premiers and the 3 territorial leaders than almost, in my memory, you'd have to go back to the early 1970s when Canada was involved in the Summit Series, hockey series against Russia. That's what it feels like in Canada.
How practical is it for Canada to disengage commercially from the US? We buy a lot of energy from you. Most of our car parts come through Canada. Even if they're made in Mexico, they tend to take a circular journey and have value added in Canada. How practical is it for Canada to look east and west and not south?
Very difficult. And this is something that's not well known or well understood in the United States, is the extent to which the Canadian and the American economies are integrated. Now, we've always had trade, back to 1867 when Canada became a country. But that over the last, I would say, 50 years, that has intensified. And then, of course, in 1988, President Reagan and Prime Minister Brian Mulroney negotiated the first free trade agreement, or the latest free trade agreement, I guess. And that increased the integration of the two economies quite significantly. Now, you brought up energy, which is my area of expertise as a journalist. So let's talk about some of those things. I had an engineer on, an electrical engineer, as a grid expert about 2, 3 weeks ago, and we talked about how the three big hydro provinces, which is Quebec, British Columbia, and Manitoba, and then the nuclear province, which is Ontario, export enormous quantities of electricity into the United States. The Northeast, New England, the Midwest, the Northwest are very dependent upon basically the exports, but there's also a lot of trade back and forth. The grids are integrated, and there are common organizations that oversee that. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford said very forcefully to the President Trump, if you continue with your tariffs, I will turn off the switch. If Canada turns off the switch on electricity imports, will that collapse grids in New York and New England, in the Midwest, in Chicago and Detroit, in the Northwest? What would it do to California? It would be devastating for the Americans. So the integration, the symbiotic relationship that our two economies have raises the question, who's more vulnerable? The supplier of natural resources, which is Canada, or the customer of those resources, which is the United States? And I would argue that the vulnerability is greater on the American side. You can be damaged more if we turn off the tap or flick the switch than we will be. And we're prepared to do it, according to our prime minister and some of our premiers.
We have university partners in Canada, and I've been there 3 times in the last year. And last month, when I was in Montreal, there were no lines for flights to the US for immigration. So now we hear the travel between Canada and the US has dropped 70%, and may still be dropping. Your thoughts?
Well, there are a couple of angles to this. One of them is there used to be a lot of travel by Canadians into the United States. Now, not that long ago, I lived in a little city in southern British Columbia called White Rock. And just on the edge of that is the Pacific border crossing into Bellevue, Washington. And we would go over all the time to get gas for the car, go down and get groceries, just to have a weekend out. All of that is stopped. I mean, those border crossings are almost deserted now. So Canadians there's a Buy Canada campaign, just a very grassroots campaign where Canadians are now looking for Canadian goods. And so that's part of that. Some of it, and so they don't want to travel into the US, but there's a very, I would say, sinister aspect to this. We've had at least a couple of stories where Canadians have crossed the border. One gal flew into LAX in Los Angeles, were seized by custom border authorities, thrown into private for-profit prisons, and literally disappeared for a couple of weeks. And those stories have spread on social media across Canada. And I, for one, I would not get within 10 miles of the US border. I've criticized President Trump and Vice President Vance a few times on my show, and I don't think I would be greeted very well at the border, and I wouldn't even just take the chance of it. And I certainly wouldn't take my phone across, because now we're being told that Canadians' phones are being seized and searched, and we have to give up passwords. There is a story here where Canadians are very plugged into this, and Americans, I don't think, are. They don't understand what's happening up in Canada in response to these pressures we're feeling.
Sports is pretty integrated. We have players from Canada and American teams. What's the state of that, and how is that likely to unfold?
Last month, there was a Four Nations hockey tournament, Canada, the US, Finland, and Sweden. And it was NHL players who were mostly in it. And it was a big story down in the US. Jimmy Kimmel and the late night crowd picked it up, where every time there was games played in Canada and the American national anthem was played, Canadians would boo loudly and lustily, showing their displeasure. Now, sports is supposed to be apolitical, right? And Canadians don't do this. In fact, I don't know if there are many occasions where a singer will be in Canada at a hockey game, will be singing the American national anthem and will stop, hold out the mic, and Canadians will finish your anthem for us in that hockey game. So for Canadians to boo your anthem is a very profound symbol of the anger that we're feeling right now.
And we also see that in stories about sports heroes being caught up in this.
I have a great story. It was just a couple of weeks ago. Everybody knows Wayne Gretzky, who holds all sorts of scoring records. He won his 4 Stanley Cup rings in Edmonton, which is in Alberta. It's the capital of Alberta. And he was revered in Edmonton as a saint. He walks on water. And outside of the arena in Edmonton, there was a big statue of Gretzky in skates and his hockey equipment. Someone is so, and he also, I should point out, Gretzky has a very close relationship with Donald Trump. They're golfing buddies. And Canadians are so angry about that, somebody went and took human excrement and smeared it all over that statue as a protest. And that story went across the country, and there were very few Canadians who were upset about it. Who maybe opposed that, and lots of positive comments about, yes, it was a symbolic protest against Gretzky and being too close to the Trump administration.
Markham, Canadians in America, outside of the White House as at present, are regarded as the kindest, nicest, friendliest people. What makes Canadians nice and friendly, if in fact I am correct?
Well, this is something that is not well understood about Canadians. And to really understand that aspect of our culture, you need to attend a small town hockey game. The Canadians walk into the arena, players and fans, and they're very polite. We're kind of, we have a British side to our culture where we're polite. The moment those players step on the ice, it's mayhem. It's a metaphor for war. And all you have to do is look at the NHL and the hockey. That's the only league that permits fighting. And invariably, it's the Canadian player. Once the game is on, once the fight is begin, we're fierce warriors. And all you have to do is look to World War I, World War II, any wars that we participate in, we've often been the shock troops. We're the ones that are given the difficult circumstances. So we're not loud, we're not obnoxious, but when we're riled, we're mighty. And I don't think that's well understood. And here's a little anecdote for you. On my social media, because we're all gentlemen of a certain age here, and our audience tends to be 55 plus for our energy journalism, I can't tell you how many 65 and 70-year-old retired men have said, I have a hunting rifle. If any of the Americans come over the border and invade Canada, I'm now a sniper. I will take up arms to defend my country. This is the tenor of our conversation in Canada.
I don't think Americans are really focused on what's happening and what's coming with Canada. Do you think that people are going to be, Americans, are going to be very surprised when they learn the consequences?
I think Americans will be very surprised to learn that we're as angry and insulted as we are. In fact, this is the way the Westminster system works. You gentlemen will understand this. It's not, you don't vote for a prime minister. You vote for your member of parliament, and the party with the most votes the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. So when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stepped down as leader of the Liberal Party, they elected a new leader who is Mark Carney. And very shortly after he was elected, he made a point of saying to Donald Trump, he said, I won't even take your phone call until you stop the talk of annexation and you treat us with the respect that we deserve as your longtime ally, your cousins and your friends. Until you do that, I won't even pick up the phone call. That is an extraordinary statement for one leader of a country to say to another leader of a country.
For the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio's POTUS channel 124, you are listening to White House Chronicle. I am Llewellyn King, executive producer and host, co-host Adam Clayton Powell III joins me. Our guest today is Markham Hislop, a Canadian journalist and host of the Energi show, and that is spelled Energi. White House Chronicle airs nationwide on PBS and public educational and government access channels. Subscribe for full episodes of White House Chronicle each week as a podcast on your favorite audio platform. Watch this and previous episodes on the White House Chronicle website, whchronicle.com. For more information on co-host Adam Clayton Powell III's University of Southern California project, contact him at truevote@usc.edu. And you can find my weekly newspaper columns on Substack. Defense is hugely integrated between the US and Canada. The dual line, our first line of defense against Russian attack, for example. Is that continuing, or has there been a pullback? Has there been a discussion of a disengagement of defense forces?
That's a very interesting question because there hasn't been to date. To the best of my knowledge, the two militaries still continue their close cooperation, but there are points of disagreement. And I've seen it argued that President Trump is actually right when he says that the allies, the NATO allies, have not shouldered their full burden of the cost of providing defense. And I think there's some sympathy here in Canada for that argument. We recognize that we've been, to some extent, freeloading or free riding on that. So there's a renewed commitment to increasing defense, particularly in the Arctic, where we're worried about Russian incursions, and the United States and Canada share that concern. So we're seeing the expenditure of we're establishing some military bases, increasing our icebreakers, that sort of thing. The big issue, I would say, has come around the purchase of the F-35 jet. There's discussions between the Canadian government and European aircraft manufacturers, and I think this one is coming out of Sweden, to actually Canada would buy European fighter aircraft to replace the F-35, and then set up factories in Canada where there would manufacturing or assembly would take place, where maintenance would take place, so that we have more control over the manufacturing and maintenance of the fighter aircraft that we use in our military.
Let's talk about how big that could be. Last fall, you posted a chart headlined, America leaves the G7 in the dust, showing the United States #1, UK #2, Canada #3, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan rounding out the G7. Do you think that President Trump's actions could actually change that order?
That's a hard one to say because I've interviewed economists on my show. We've talked about this issue of what is President Trump trying to achieve by changing the global geopolitical order, the rules-based order that we've had, at least since the Second World War, and that America has arguably been the undisputed leader of. But he seems to want to change that. And he seems to be putting pressure on any number of his allies, both in, he wants to annex Greenland, he wants to annex Canada, he wants to change, pull back NATO commitments in Europe, on and on and on. But if there's a vision here, if there's a strategy, it's not apparent to everybody. And I read a lot of American writers on these kinds of topics, and I think everyone's just confused at this point. What is the strategy, and how will other, former allies or current allies, I should say, how will they adapt to those changes? So Adam, I would say at this point, we're just confused. We don't know where this is all going, and we're kind of tap dancing as best we can at the moment.
We have always been very friendly to Canada in the US and simultaneously incurious about it. I've always found it one of the extraordinary things that our weather forecasts at night, the map stops at the Canadian border. as though Canadians have no weather unless we're blaming them for cold, because it's always a Canadian vortex or some such thing. Uh, Tell us some of the basics about Canada. I mentioned that it has a larger landmass than the US. Population, how much of it is French speaking? How pervasive is the dual language? We are always surprised when we hear a Canadian premier break into French. Give us a thumbnail of Canada.
Sure. 40 million people, and the majority of the population is in eastern Canada. So that would be Ontario is about 15 million. Quebec is, which is to the east, is 7 million, and then another million or so in the Maritime provinces. And then you have the four western provinces, which is Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, and those are about 12 million. So we're a population of 40 million. The Canada's economy historically has been the hewers of wood and drawers of water. A lot of our we're essentially a raw material supplier to the American economy. So, for instance, the American economy imports 6 million barrels a day of oil. We provide 4 million barrels of that. 3.3 million barrels of that is ultra heavy sour crude, comes from the oil sands in northern Alberta. The refineries in the Midwest, in the Rocky Mountains, in the US Gulf Coast have spent tens of billions of dollars to reconfigure refineries to run that heavy crude. Literally, when it comes out of the ground, it's like peanut butter. And it has to be, so it has to be diluted to get down to market, but it's very heavy. And the 100% of the imports, 2.5 million barrels a day of imports into the Midwest, for example, come from Canada. And so natural gas, a lot of it is imported. Mining, minerals, a lot of what we produce in Canada is sent down raw into the US. Lumber and timber out of British Columbia and Ontario sent down into the US. So your economy is very dependent upon our raw materials. Now, one of the things that Donald Trump has done is put 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Well, aluminum is one of our big exports, and we currently provide 56% of your aluminum. And the reason we do that is because Quebec has very large deposits of bauxite, but also it has enormous hydro dams, and it can produce clean, reliable, cheap electricity, which is the big input into aluminum. So we can produce very clean aluminum, very high quality at a very low price. And that's an important input into many of your manufacturing industries, including automotive. So it's a great mystery to us why we would be punishing those industries that your manufacturing industries rely upon so heavily. And you can go across the country and you can find examples of that all over the place, where you need us and yet you keep wanting to punish us, but the ultimate the ultimate industry that will suffer the most is the American industry and ultimately the American consumer. It defies logic, to be honest.
This probably hasn't affected a lot of Americans yet that they can feel directly, but American politics are all over the place, according to polls. And of course, the only polls that count are when people actually go to the polls and vote. But CNN had an analysis last week, which was surprising to a lot of people, that Donald Trump is a quote, basically is more popular than he was today at any time in term number one, more popular than he was when he won election back in November of 2024. Then NBC News, Americans increasingly say the country, the United States, is on the right track. Again, according to NBC's poll, 44%, highest number since 2004, more than 20 years ago. The bottom line is the percentage of Americans who say that we're on the right track is through the roof. That's remarkable given all the things that are happening. Do you think that people just don't feel it yet?
I don't think they pay attention. And I had a pollster, Frank Graves from Eco Research, is very well respected in Canada, and I had him on the show on the weekend. And we were talking about this, and polls consistently show that 75 to 80% of Canadians cannot stand Donald Trump.
In recent times, Canada has been regarded, and it was pointed out by the magazine The Economist, as essentially an underperforming economy. Given its riches, given its talent, it hasn't done as well as might be expected. Do you think that this trouble, this difficulty with Donald Trump was going to spur Canada on, and that it's going to start adding much more value to its raw materials, which is always a way of increasing real value, real wealth in a country, rather than simply exporting its raw materials? Is this some sort of strange blessing wrapped up in disguise?
That is a fascinating question, Llewellyn. I'm glad you asked it. And it's not clear. Economists differ on how they view the Canadian economy, because on the one hand, our labor productivity has been falling. The American labor productivity has been rising, which means more wealth for workers and more wealth for those who own capital. Ours has been going in the opposite direction. A lot of it has to do, we think, with lower levels of capital investment, particularly in the oil and gas industry. But I don't think there's a consensus on that yet. So the question then becomes, if we re-engineer the national economy and we begin adding value to oil and gas. Now, I'll give you one example. This is my favorite one as an oil and gas reporter. Alberta has a provincial agency which has been working on this for a decade, but it's about a year away from being able to take bitumen, which has a very unique hydrocarbon model, and turn it into the precursor for carbon fiber. So if they're successful and they can produce inexpensive carbon fiber using bitumen, then you can build an advanced materials manufacturing industry in Alberta using bitumen as the feedstock. So instead of shipping it down to American refineries basically raw, you would then create a domestic market for it, and you would add value in Alberta instead of in the United States. And there are examples of that in critical minerals. We could smelt and refine and make battery metals here in Canada. We could take timber and make it mass timber instead of just 2x4s or raw logs, on and on and on. So does this have this new strategy and the East-West trade and the export strategy combined? Does it have the potential to be the best thing that's happened to Canada in the last 50 years? Yes. Will we execute on it? Now, that's an open question. I don't think we know. There certainly is the determination, and I have to tell you, I mean, Mark Carney, is a very, very good economist. And watching him field these kind of questions in press conferences, he thinks in full sentences. He thinks in full paragraphs. That's how he speaks. And so he's been laying out this strategy, and it's astonishing. I can't remember a political leader who was that astute and that well-grounded in this kind of field. So I would say I'm optimistic, but time will tell.
That's our show for today. Thank you, gentlemen. We're out of time. I would like to say that I think we should always be grateful to Canada because they were able to help us during the difficult time of prohibition. Cheers.